everybody. Welcome. My name is Karen Boss. I am a senior editor at Charlesbridge Publishing, and we are located in Massachusetts. And we're here to talk today about folk tales and fairy tales and fractured fairy tales. And we really want to talk about the continuation of that tradition and reimagining fairy tales through representation. So that's what we're here for. And I'm going to ask each of our guests today to introduce themselves briefly, and we will start with Carolyn.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Caroline Brewer, the author of Anansi and the Talking Cloth, and I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C.
Excellent. And let's go to JaNay.
Hi, I'm JaNay Brown-Wood. I'm the author of Acacia, a Rapunzel Tale, and I am in Sacramento, California.
Awesome. And finally, Shana.
Hi, my name is Shana Keller, and I currently live 15 minutes from the beach near Wilmington, North Carolina, and I'm the author of CC Underground Railroad Cinderella.
Wonderful. All right. Well, welcome all of you. And I'm so glad to be with you today to have this conversation and to really talk about some interesting stuff that I think will be of interest to our audience as well. And I also want to say how much I love each of these three books. It's been such a pleasure to see them get worked on and come to life and come out into the world. And I know that we're still waiting for some of them to be available. So I want to start off by sort of asking a question that all of you can answer in turn. Folk tales and fairy tales tend to be some of the first stories that kids encounter, like when they are first starting to be read to or when they're first reading on their own. And I always say that any book that a kid picks up teaches them a little bit about what it means to be human. And I'm wondering how in particular you think that folk tales and fairy tales do that. What can kids learn from these kinds of stories?
Okay, well, the first thing that pops into my mind is the moral ground. So instantly, like when I think of fairy tales and folk tales, I think of what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do. So a lot of those have that baseline that teach kids that take it out of let's say like a legal context. You know, like when you grow up, you realize, oh, there's laws, we can break laws, we can end up in jail if we don't follow them. But when you have fairy tales and you're a young child, you maybe don't quite fully understand that concept. You know, I don't even know when I first heard of the term law, but it just gives you that compass, the moral compass. It starts to give you real world stories or examples of a moral compass.
Excellent. I like that. I think that that's one of the things that's so interesting is that fairy tales and folk tales through history often come with a moral or a lesson, right? You might say at the end. JaNay, you look like you were ready to jump in.
Yeah, you know, when I think about fairy tales and folk tales and just traditional literature, it also teaches us about overcoming obstacles. I appreciate that. Sometimes they're fantastical obstacles, but you get to see a protagonist going through a challenge and then overcoming it. And then on top of that, I feel like it teaches children about universals. So in many of these stories, there are these themes that are shared across cultures. And within each of the cultures, those themes can still really shine through. And I think fairy tales do that in a really, really strong way.
Excellent. And how about you, Carolyn?
Yes, I agree. The moral underpinnings that come from fairy tales and folk tales, I think, are so helpful as children are growing and developing and thinking about who they are and their place in the world. And also the roles of various characters, the skills, the creativity, the power of relationships. I think that is one of the most important things that we get from fairy tales because we see how people in different positions with different characteristics and skills and intelligences use what they have to achieve something generally for the greater good. And if they're not using what they have for the greater good, then somebody else comes along and shines a light on how that's possible. So, you know, as we grow and develop, we are in relationship with people all of our lives. And so learning how to be in relationships that are positive and strong, I think is one of the best things that can happen when we share fairy tales and folk tales with our children.
Something else beyond what is in the story, right? What is in a fairy tale, I think something else that is very human is the storytelling. It's the passing on these stories from generation to generation. And fairy tales, like when you're listening to a fairy tale, you know it's a story. You're engaged. You're like, "Ooh, what's going to happen next?" And while it has the morals and it has the overcoming, it's also allows you to just engage in the fun and the beauty of story. And whether it's reading it from the pages of a book or telling it from memory best you can, this idea of transmitting story, I think that's very human, and that's a beautiful thing that children can share with the loved ones in their lives through fairy tales and folk tales and all those sorts of stories.
That's fantastic. Thanks for that. I think that notion that so many different cultures have these kinds of folk tales and fairy tales, and that there are also adaptations of similar stories in different cultures as well, and how those come through. So let me go to you, Shauna, and ask you specifically, what opportunities or challenges did you really feel when you set forth to connect a beloved fairy tale to a historical experience? So your book is a retelling of Cinderella, but
Mhm.
it in the main character is an enslaved girl who is going to be involved in the Underground Railroad, right? So you took this historical moment and retold it and married those two things. So what opportunities and challenges did you feel like when you were doing that?
Okay, the biggest challenge. Okay, I had a very strong drive to do it because I grew up on Cinderella. It was one of my favorites, and then Beauty and the Beast was another favorite. And I was like, they don't really look like, me or whatever. And so the biggest challenge was to not trivialize the slavery aspect, I would say.
Mm.
Because it's such, like, I remember how uncomfortable I felt learning about slavery, being one of maybe like three or four people of color in my classroom. And there was no consideration of how we might have taken it or felt. And I'm not trying to say, like they should have treated us a certain way, but it has an impact. And I learned the term. I can't think of it, but there's a term for it. But trauma is in the word, like, or in this term. But I felt that when I was reading about it. And so I just was really, really cognizant of not trivializing it and creating something that if my self back then would have not felt any discomfort reading, would have felt, proud to read the story and maybe even inspired, and have an opportunity to process the historical trauma of slavery, because I don't think we were ever given that kind of grace. And I think that's why there's so much shame associated with teaching, in slavery and enslaved, about enslaved people. And I just had to make sure, and I think we accomplished it. I feel really good about it. And I will say too, to share one of our inside stories with Laura Freeman, how when we first saw the sketches, the prince that she illustrated was not a Eurocentric prince. It was an African prince. And that was like, oh, that was like the final piece of that puzzle where I realized, okay, we really didn't trivialize it, because we, thanks to Laura, kept an accuracy to our character, the character Cece, of who she would have dreamt of and who she would have, wanted to rescue. And obviously there's a twist at the end. But I felt very strongly and very nervous, to be completely honest, about making sure we didn't trivialize slavery or a young girl going through something so traumatic, but also still being empowered to process that. And like, there was absolute dignity in Cece's character without um, diminishing the trauma that she was in, and without making it uncomfortable for somebody like me back then, or even young kids that I've talked to and met today, even today, that still get uncomfortable talking about that time period, and I know this might lead into other questions with teachers and how to create, in a sense, a safe space for them to give children an opportunity to process the trauma of our nation's history that we've never been given before. And so I think these types of retellings are very, very important, because it's a perfect tool for that, I think.
Excellent. Thank you. So I want to go to Carolyn now and talk about your book, Anansi and the Talking Cloth. So Anansi is a spider character whose stories have been passed down over generations. In parts of Africa, but also have been retold in the United States in more recent decades, really, I guess. But your story is an Anansi story, and it is an original one. You didn't retell an Anansi story that existed in the past. You made up a new one. And it's also about kente cloth, which has a serious cultural significance. And all of those things came together in your story. So I wanted to ask, like, tell us about how you came to this story and how you decided to marry those two elements together.
Yes. So I took my first and so far only trip to Ghana in 2013, and it was a literacy mission trip, for lack of a better term, led by Kwame Alexander, who we all know, and he took a bunch of friends who were writers and educators, and so was Kwesi Asari, who had recently relocated to the United States and also is a Ghanaian, and had a looming house or a weaving house in one of the villages that we visited. And our goal in visiting this village was to share what we knew about developing a love for literacy, and we also helped stock a library that Kwame had established. So Kwesi, being a native Ghanaian and a master storyteller as a kente weaver, someone who's familiar with dozens and dozens of African proverbs, said he always wanted to see a story about the history of kente cloth woven with Anansi the spider tails, which he grew up on. And I told him I thought that was quite a tall task, but I would consider it. And so I spent several months researching Anansi stories and the history of kente cloth. Thank God for libraries that allowed me to do that. And I knew it had to be original because, this to weave in the history of kente cloth. I had not seen that done. And so it just so happened that the history itself, where people around the world were starting to wear machine-made cloth more than the handmade kente cloth that is just so gorgeous and thoughtful, and a source of tremendous economic resource for the people of Ghana. And so that started to help me shape the story, and then to be able to play around with Anansi and all of his trickster past, and his cunning, and his role as the chief griot, in folktale history. So I had so much to work with, and that's how the story came together.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carolyn. And JaNay, for you, so Acacia is not your first foray into retelling fairy tales, right? So Mahogany, who makes an appearance in Acacia, has a book that's a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, and that one came first. And then you also have Amani's Moon, which also is an original folktale, and that's set in a Maasai village as well. So why have you explored so much with retelling fairy tales? Why do you think you can take a contemporary issue and bring it to the fore through something as ancient as a fairy tale or a folktale? What led you to all of that?
Yeah, so I'm going to start off with kind of the why I write these fractured fairy tales, right? In today's, day and age, I think one of the reasons is because when I was younger, and I've shared this many times, I didn't see, when we were learning about fairy tales and fables and all of that, I never saw characters that looked like me or that reminded me of myself and my family. And that is why I try to write these diverse fractured fairy tales today, so that children of lots of backgrounds can find these loved and well-known stories, but with characters that look like them. So that speaks to a little bit of why I write the types that I do now. But to answer your question about why some of these older tales can be then woven in with contemporary ideas, I think it goes back to how fairy tales have these universals, which means these themes or these aspects that readers can connect to across generations, across cultures. So ideas of like perseverance, any culture anywhere can connect to this idea of having a difficult challenge and then wanting to overcome it and finding ways to overcome it. Or themes and universals like love or like how your voice matters. So I think about Acacia, right? It's based on the Rapunzel tale. And when we think, at least in my opinion, when I think about universals within that tale, here you have this girl who's stolen away, locked away in a tower. Her voice isn't shared with the world. Only one witch comes and visits her by climbing up her hair, has her power over this character, and eventually someone comes and saves her so that can then be reunited and be brought back into the world. I think many kids might connect to this idea of not feeling as if your voice is loud, not being able to step out of a comfort zone, being locked away in this way. But then to have someone come and help you overcome that issue, I think, again, it's something that kids can connect to. But what I wanted to do with my story is I didn't want it to be a prince that came to help Acacia get out of her tower, but instead it's mahogany. It's this sisterhood, this bond. It's using problem solving and their own creativity and their skills to figure out how to overcome this obstacle and save Acacia from this tower. So this is all to say that there are these universals that across generations and cultures, like I said, can connect to. But I wanted to make it contemporary in this idea of girl power, of sisterhood, of using your own talents and who you are to really overcome that obstacle, break free of the tower and become your full authentic self. And I think that's why I'm able to do that now, because of those universals.
So I love all of everything that you all just shared. And one of the things that I'm struck with in all of these stories is that what JaNay just said about the girl power. So in like JaNay just described how it works in Acacia. And then we have Cece, where Cece's helped by Binti the cook. And then also the reveal at the end of that book is that it's Harriet Tubman who's come to help her, who again is a woman. And then in Anansi, at the end of the day, he needs his wife's help in order to figure out the best solution to the problem that's in front of them. So there's a lot of women power in these stories too, girl and women power, which I think over time, regardless of what culture you come from or where you live, that is still an issue for in many, many places, including the United States. So I love that there's this extra added layer of that as well. So I think a lot of times there's going to be teachers and librarians who are looking at using your stories and then often pairing them maybe with a traditional version of the book, right? I read Cece to a bunch of school kids, and we had to reference an original Cinderella story to remind them of the plot of Cinderella in order for them to better understand the flow of Cece, right? And I think we have Disney animation to thank for a lot of these stories being familiar to kids, right? But if a teacher were to take a traditional version of your tale and put it next to your book, and I think in your case, Carolyn, it might be another Anansi story or one of the more traditional Anansi stories that has been put into picture book form, right? So what do you hope, and anybody can jump in on the answer to this, what do you hope would be some of the comparisons that the kids themselves would notice and draw if that were the lesson that they were, I say lesson. If the teacher or librarian were doing a story time or putting a curriculum day together where they were looking at them side by side, what are some of those comparisons that you would hope that kids would notice or would comment on?
Yeah, I think Anansi's character first and foremost, because he's the driver of the story, and he's got a whole legion of tales that help us get to know him and who he is. So I would hope that they would see the similarities between this contemporary Anansi and the historical one, and then also his wife. She is not in all the tales. She's not in a lot that I've read, but when she shows up, how does she show up? So I hope that they would notice that. The other thing is the setting. The Anansi stories are, it's an animal kingdom, and so even though Anansi is most often depicted as half man, half spider, his world, most of the characters that he engages in with the historical folk tales, they're animals. And in this case, there's a lot more human element to the other characters in the story. That's more prominent. They're not named turtle or frog or rabbit. They have human names. So those are three of the big things I think I'd be interested in them looking into.
Yeah, I think for me, looking at, of course, the core elements of the story, like what you're saying, plot lines is important, and looking at the similarities. But my hope would extend past that. I would want teachers to discuss those commonalities, but I would hope that it would be a story starter for the differences. And what I mean by that is I would love educators to talk to children about some of the cultural differences in the stories, in your your mentor text, and then in my case, like one of my fractured fairy tales. What are some things that are different? But then I would hope that that would start a conversation of, now, if you were to write a story like this using your family or your culture, what are some things that you would use? And so I like the similarities piece to allow for the structure of the story, but I would want to spend more time talking about how these things are different and how culture is infused in it, and then allowing for children to think about how could they infuse their experiences into those stories. I think that's where the rich dialogue and the rich learning would really take place.
And I think most kids love to share about their own selves, their own families, their own experience, and that a lot of them would jump right in and be like, "In my family, it would be this way because it would be a little different from how it is with acacia and or with mahogany," right? And I think those kinds of conversations, like you say, can be really rich around not only kids realizing that their cultures matter, but how could
Yes.
they also show up in stories, particularly if they're from a culture that has traditionally been underrepresented in children's literature in the United States. Yeah.
I could not agree more. And what it offers is validation. So not only, is my story important or my cultural background important, I can weave it into these fairy tales that I've been learning since I've been a child and I've seen on Disney, etc. So talk about that connection to the traditional literature, but then doing it in a way that now you see yourself and you feel like, your voice and your family and what's important to you guys when you put it into your own story that's a fairy tale, how just meaningful that can be for a child.
I also think the animation companies in the US have done better in recent years about really inviting more culture into those stories, right? We have Moana, we have Encanto, we have Coco, right? And so there's as many kids in this country who are not kids of color watching those movies and really opening their minds to the fact that not everybody in fairy tales is white, right? And that I think has been really helpful. And then now to have even more stories that are pulling that culture into the fairy tales and the folk tales, I think is not only allowing kids of color to see themselves, but also to invite white kids to understand that the world doesn't totally revolve around them, right? And that's really important, I think.
And the beautiful elements of other cultures. I mean, when I think of like Coco and Dia de los Muertos and learning about all these things, I remember learning new things as an adult and being captivated by it. The child gets to see themselves in their culture, but then those who do not belong to that culture get to learn about something that's different from their own experience. So that whole, mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors, and inviting through all of that connection because of it. And I think that's such a core piece, that connective piece.
Yeah, it's good you bring up the mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors. You know, Rudine Sims Bishop's concept is still with us very much. It's been around for a while, and it's important that we remember that it is a threefold concept, right? And so, Shauna, what about you with this same question? What would you hope that would happen with a comparison for yours?
Definitely, like everything that was said, because and also too, like to piggyback on that a little bit more too, one of the dangers I've seen with keeping literature segregated is that we forget everybody was all there together anyway. And so I really love cross pollinating all races in my story. And like that's why, putting Cece where, she was the main character, but it was her family, obviously. The white side that one of the big reveals too that we had and we debated on, we talked to the teachers about sharing, is like Cece was legitimately their half sister, because that was the history back in the day. They found a way to populate their plantations, and so it's like it's giving everybody a place without sugarcoating it, but also without browbeating it in a sense. And then so that's also a huge factor, because I feel like when we go back and we read those stories, like you were mentioning, JaNay, like not seeing any representation, you start to think, well, were we even there? Like where were we? Like who did I just show up? Like where did I come from? And so one of the things too, like okay, I'm gonna switch gears again back to the teachers. I think one of the coolest things about especially modern fairy tale retellings, even though CC's historical, but some of these are not, is like it takes the magic out of the fairy tales. And so when you're reading a fairy tale, at least for me, you're like, oh, this only happens because it's magic. But then the supernatural element. But then when you break it down and it sounds like in a lot of these, you see that magic was because somebody helped somebody. That magic was because somebody had the courage, to ask for help, or to go out and do whatever they needed to do. So you start to bring the magic back inside to that character, or and I think this is what you were saying, Caroline, like it could be the hero aspect. Maybe it's not the fairy godmother necessarily. Maybe it's the main character that has the courage to ask for help. Maybe it's the community that doesn't turn that person in. And I'm just thinking from a standpoint of escaping slavery. Like the magic comes from everywhere outside of you, or it comes from you. It's not supernatural. And so I think one of the cool, fun things to compare with fairy tales is where you think, oh, this is just out of their control. They had a fairy godmother. True, but maybe that fairy godmother happened because somebody went and approached them and sought them for, help or assistance. So I think that's a big one, especially for young kids, like to get that sense of empowerment, to get that sense of identity, especially though, and it is better now. Still more ways to go, but it's a lot better now in terms of seeing the representation. But coming from, I'm writing from that perspective of what I saw and grew up with. And I'm like, that would have been nice, to see all these other elements and different characters, but it was so specific. It was like, the blinders on a horse, where you didn't see anything outside of what you were given. And so it's very hard to develop a sense of identity. It's very hard to develop courage. It's very hard to develop trust. But when you can overcome all of that and see that in your community, it does feel like magic. And so I think that balance is kind of fun for kids today to be like, oh, what we would call magic back then, what do you see yourself helping? And there's been so many kids. I've seen so many stories where kids just turn tragedies around or challenges around, and you're like, that's incredible. I wouldn't even thought about that. I'm a little jaded now in my life. Like for kids, it's like there's still so much hope, but these retellings are also kind of reconfirming to them that it is coming from them. It's not coming from anywhere else but them.
So one of the things that's interesting about Cece is that it is a retelling of Cinderella, but it's also meta in that Cece reads Cinderella in the story. And that's different from what you usually see in a fractured retelling or any kind of retelling, right? Normally it's like, okay, we know how Cinderella went, and so we're going to make the book work the same way. But the thing that I was so struck by from the very beginning of your book, Shauna, is really that enslaved kids would have known fairy tales, even though they were kept from reading and writing for the most part, because they often, when they were children, would be paired with the children of the enslavers and then would learn those stories, right? And so for me, that's such an interesting piece of your retelling in that it has that meta element in it.
Mhm.
But it seems to me that from the beginning, you were very clear that that was an essential element of your storytelling, that Cece has to come across the fairy tale somehow, right?
Yes.
And so did you realize at the time that that was sort of meta and it was changing the traditional retelling, or was it just like so natural that you didn't even think about it?
I would love to say I planned it, but I didn't. Like, it was one of those things where I was like, okay, I saw this. I knew I wanted this in there. I saw that. I knew I wanted that in there. And then somehow now it makes sense. Maybe like my instincts were ahead of my logic. Maybe that's the only thing I can think of. But no, no, like, yeah,
Okay, that's
And
great.
that,
yeah, it was not like,
Yeah,
it was,
Yeah,
JaNay.
and
yeah. It's the same thing where I was like appalled that I didn't think of the prince in a traditional African sense. I don't even think I thought of him as European, but to share the background story, Laura Freeman was our illustrator, and she thought she was pushing back because she drew him as an African prince, but initially he was a Eurocentric one, and she's like, she couldn't even finish the drawing. She's like, this doesn't feel right. And then I heard, of course, the process. We heard it from the art director, and then Karen shares it, and then I was like, she was absolutely right. Like, how did I didn't even think of that. Like, so it's kind of that same, like, luckily all the pieces fell together, properly.
And can I add that I think it's important in this discussion to recognize that all of these cultures have had fairy tales and folk tales. It's my understanding that there's an African Cinderella that came before the one that we've grown up with in the United States, and so not only might Cece have heard of the Cinderella tale from the children of the enslaver, but she might have heard Anansi stories from her
Exactly.
parents and her grandparents. And, these cultures are much older than American culture and a lot of European culture. And I think that's something else that we can pass on to children when we're talking to them about fairy tales and folk tales. And, not only the fact that we've got an opportunity to see representation in the tales that we're familiar with and to learn about other cultures, but to know that other cultures have had these kinds of stories as well for quite some time. And so a lot of what we've grown up with is an adaptation of what came before. So
That's a really important point. It really is. And I think partly the fact that many, many stories have had oral traditions and have not been written down. And so the European and the white sort of cultural idea is that if it's not written down, it's not legit, which is so untrue and so important in so many cultures, how much is orally shared and passed down. Exactly. Okay, so now as we finish up today, I wanted to just make sure that if there anything else that any of you or each of you want to share that hasn't been said yet, that you want to be sure to get into today's conversation. So who wants to jump in with last things?
I'd like to just also piggyback on what Shauna said about the magic. One of the things that we hear about the difference between folk tales and fairy tales is that there often isn't magic in folk tales. Um, but the magic shows up in different ways. It's often fantastical. It's and in the case of Anansi, he has the power to change into different animals, and he does so in Anansi and the Talking Cloth. But I've always seen, as Shauna shared, that the real power is in what they do humanly that feels magical. What they do with their relationships, what they do with their wisdom, what they do with their sense of community. And so beautiful, magical things come out of that. And it gives children an opportunity to look into themselves and see, what can I do with my own powers, whether it's powers of love, powers of humor, powers of creativity. All of these things create magic in real life, and so we want them to be able to connect with that in the characters that they see in folk tales. So I think it all goes back to what it means to be human. That's what fairy tales and folk tales can teach us and teach children ultimately in ways that will last a lifetime.
You know, one of the things I want to talk about related to Acacia and the Rapunzel tales. That when we think of the Rapunzel tale, it's centered on hair, right? She had this long hair, and that's what she would use to allow for people to come up and down into her tower. But I wanted to spin this a little bit with centering the story on a Black character as Rapunzel, because of course within the Black community, hair is it's a pretty important cultural piece. So while yes, initially Ma Gothel uses Rapunzel's hair to climb up the tower, I tried to take it in a different way. And so when you read the story, I'm not going to give you too many spoilers, but when you read the story, you get to see some of the versatility of Black hair. And I loved that because it feels like, of course, for hair, there's an aspect of self expression that comes with it. And for African Americans within society, Black hair being stigmatized, I wanted to lean into this with this idea that even though Ma Gothel wants Acacia's hair to be a certain way, she untwists it and allows it to be, what she wants it to be as a form of self-expression. So I liked that idea of kind of playing with the versatility of hair and using that same theme as within Rapunzel, but shifting it in a way that feels culturally relevant for the African American community. And then the final piece is just idea of like venturing outside of your comfort zone and writing your own story. And Acacia starts off with retelling stories she's read in books, but it ends with her starting to tell her own story as her and Acacia walk away from this tower. New adventure begins.
All right. And Shana, do you want to take us home?
I'll try. I don't I guess the biggest takeaway with the hope and goal of this book, whether it's in a teacher's hands or student's hands, is a lot of elements of just acknowledging our history, acknowledging, like we were talking about earlier, our ability to make changes on our own, to have the courage if there's something in our lives that we need to change. It just takes so much courage for a child, especially if they don't feel like they have a huge network, to reach outside of themselves to get help, because at the core of this story, Cinderella also touches on, abuse. It touches on institutionalized privilege. It touches on so many, aspects that we still see today. And it puts it in a framework that a kid can understand, when we're going back to the moral aspect of, this isn't right. Why does this person have all these privileges? Why am I in charge of taking care of them? Why do I have to sleep on the floor just because they're scared? Nobody's looking out for my interests. And then making it digestible so that they can realize that they matter too, just as much as the next child, just as much as the next person. And hopefully seeing, like, similar with JaNay's story, it's like, I don't think this is going to end with a prince, because the true value that we're teaching, or that I think we're seeing in all of these fairy tales, it's your courage, but it's also your freedom. It's your freedom to be who you are, what you want out of life, to pursue your own goals and dreams, and ideally have, an equal platform to be able to do all those things in. So
Thank you again for all of you for being here today. And really, this conversation was incredibly rich. I think that these kinds of conversations are really helpful for anybody in the world who's thinking about these kinds of picture books, thinking about how kids might really engage with them. There's really so much happening, I think, in publishing today to really try to get unrepresented voices more represented. And I'm just so thrilled that Charles Bridge is a home for all three of you and for your books. And we love working with all of you. And so thank you so much for joining me today and for having such rich, really interesting, wonderful stuff to say. So thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you, Charles Bridge.